Centaurs are the most famous wild mortal creatures of mythical zoology, with a human head, arms and torso on a horse's body. The oldest known images of centaurs are found on antique vases dating back to the 6th century BC. The first drawings of a centaur depicted it with human legs, only the back part was horse-like. The most common theory is that the idea of centaurs arose from the first reaction of civilized peoples unfamiliar with horseback riding, to the nomadic horsemen of the Scythian or Turkic tribes. This can explain the violent and ferocious nature of centaurs in legends and myths. Many Greek writers and historians, such as Homer, Plutarch, Socrates, Ptolemy, mention centaurs in their works. The Kassite nomads, who came to Mesopotamia from Iran around 1750 BC, erected huge stone statues of guardian gods, including centaurs, along the borders of their empire. However, since the Kassite Empire ceased to exist by the middle of the 12th century BC, we can rightfully claim that the history of the centaur goes back more than 3,000 years. The appearance of the image of the centaur suggests that even during the time of the Kassites, the horse played an important role in human life, but centuries passed before the horse became a familiar companion of man in the Middle East. Perhaps ancient farmers perceived horse riders as a holistic being. But most likely, the inhabitants of the Mediterranean, prone to inventing composite creatures, invented the centaur. The creature known as the centaur appeared in the Middle East between 1750 and 1250 BC and served as a guardian spirit, whose main weapon was a bow and arrow. The Kassites, who had extensive trade links, brought the centaur to the Mycenaean civilization, which also disappeared by the middle of the 12th century BC. From Crete, the centaur came to ancient Greece. Also, according to ancient legends, centaurs came from the mountains of Greece, where their relations with the locals were quite difficult. Since some centaurs were partial to wine, they quickly became enraged and fought with people more than once. A centaur with 4 horse legs was perceived by the Greeks more as an animal than a man. Despite the human head, his ears are almost always horse-like, and his face is rough and bearded. The centaur was usually depicted naked, with both male and horse genitals. If in Greece the centaur was the embodiment of animal qualities incompatible with human nature, unbridled passions and immoderate sexuality, then in ancient Rome he turned into a peace-loving companion of Dionysus and Eros. Centaurs were considered the descendants of Ixion and Nephili, either direct or through a common ancestor of the tribe, Centaur, who followed Magnesian Mares. Some say that the centaurs were raised on Pelion by nymphs and, when they grew up, they mated with Mares, which gave birth to the dual-natured centaurs. Some centaurs were taken out of this genealogical line, probably to ennoble them. Thus, the centaur Chiron was considered the son of Zeus and the mare Philyra, and the centaur Pholus was the son of Silenus. Sometimes the centaurs are considered the offspring of Poseidon, which is explained by the mythological past of this deity. There is also a myth that the centaurs lived in the mountains of Thessaly until the day when Hercules scattered them throughout Hellas. Most of them were killed by Hercules. Those who escaped from Hercules, listening to the sirens, stopped eating and died of hunger. If the image of centaurs can be linked to the surprise of the Greeks when they met horsemen, then the Greeks themselves came up with their mythological origin. There are several legends about where the half-human, half-horse creatures came from. According to one legend, the god Apollo met the beautiful nymph Stilba. They had 2 sons, Centaur and Lapith. Lapith was a giant or half-tree. Centaur also came out deformed with a human head and torso and a horse's body and legs. Both had numerous offspring, which for some unknown reason began to feud mortally. According to another legend, Centaur was the son of Ixion, the son of the god of war Ares. Ixion ended up on Olympus thanks to the pity of Zeus, where he fell in love with Hera. Despite Zeus's angry nature, the supreme god did not get angry, but created a copy of Hera from a cloud, calling her Nephili. It was in the marriage of Ixion and Nephili that Centaur was born. In ancient times, centaurs were common creatures that inhabited the entire territory of Greece. Later, the centaur's habitat was greatly reduced, and it was believed that they survived only in the Greek mountains of northern Thessaly and Epirus. Some of the last information about centaurs dates back to the 9th century AD, but the mythical creatures did not disappear, they simply learned to hide well. Mortal centaurs had one big common flaw: they were not allowed to drink alcoholic beverages. When drunk, the half-man half-horse became uncontrollable, wild and fierce. At the same time, they were considered honest and straightforward, although there were also insidious individuals. Centaurs were very good at war, distinguished by excellent physical strength, speed, mobility, and were masters of the bow and spear. As protection, they used only shields, and from clothing they recognized only cloaks. Now imagine that you live hundreds of years ago and have never seen a single horse. Suddenly you catch sight of a rider who seems to be attached to his mount, who easily jumps over ditches and fences or gallops across the plain. You may have thought that a man and a horse are one creature. Some North American Indians thought so too when they first saw Spanish horsemen. In ancient times, in the mountains of Thessaly in Greece, there lived people who hunted on the backs of wild bulls. They were such excellent riders that the inhabitants of the surrounding regions began to sincerely believe that their neighbors were strange creatures, half men and half horses. This is where the myth of centaurs came from. Centaurs in Greek mythology were just such man-horses who lived in the mountains of Thessaly and Arcadia. They led a free and wild life, which is why the great ancient Greek poet Homer called them wild beasts. Probably no one argues anymore that any legends and myths are based on some real events. The same applies to the myths of ancient Greece. For example, the mention of centaurs in the description of the exploits of Hercules. To understand this, we need to understand who the centaurs are. They are usually depicted as half horses, half people, wild and solitary inhabitants of forests and mountains. Their strange appearance is puzzling, because not a single skeleton of such creatures has been found. What could possibly connect centaurs with horses, except for their appearance? They have much more in common with people. They, like people, eat meat, drink wine, know herbal medicines, and use fire. And they speak not their own language, but a human language. So these creatures are people by nature. And their appearance indicates some national or professional feature. It is quite obvious that this is the image of a rider, in which two creatures are merged into a single whole, a horse and a man. These are people for whom horse breeding is their main occupation, one might say, the meaning of existence. Sitting on horseback, they feel most natural, in their native element. What does science tell us about centaurs? And here we will find unexpected things. In ancient times, close relationships between people and animals were considered commonplace. Many peoples even believed that they descended from animals. For example, the Tibetans considered a monkey to be their ancestor, the Hindus, a horse, and the inhabitants of Thailand, a dog. In general, the ancient Greeks and Romans, if we are to believe historical sources, could not live without unnatural relationships. The Greek scientist Thales, as legend has it, advised his master Periander not to trust sheep to unmarried shepherds if he wanted to avoid the birth of centaurs. The Roman satirical poet Juvenal wrote that Roman women often bared their buttocks in front of donkeys, enticing them to have close relationships. In Egypt, such relationships were part of the fertility cult ceremony. It turns out that not a single battle in those days could take place without a herd of small cattle, sheep or goats. These uncomplaining animals served the soldiers not only as food, but also as objects of unnatural intercourse. Satisfying soldiers with the help of animals was considered a lesser evil than using the services of paid women. Serious scientists, Paracelsus, Cardano, the famous Italian obstetrician of the 16th century Lycidi, several times recorded cases of animals giving birth to human children in women, animals or hybrids. Reports of geneticists' experiments began to appear in serious specialized publications. In test tubes, they managed to obtain so-called chimeras, embryos in which some of the cells were human, and some were animal, mouse, sheep, monkey. And maybe people with such mutations have lived at all times? Examples of the birth of animal people can be found in some medical books of the 19th to 20th centuries. For example, the famous theologian Settler claimed in 1940 that freaks can be the result of an unnatural union between a man and an animal. At the end of the last century, some British researchers described cases of black women living with gorillas. Their children did simple housework and could even speak a little. And who knows, maybe in some mysterious corners of our planet far from civilization, these mythical creatures still live. What do you think about this, dear viewers? Write about it in your comments. And see you on the channel.